thank you all for being here with us. I'm glad you could come and brave our small little snowstorm that we just had. Hopefully, we just looked at the weather last night, and it looks like we're going to be into at least the 40s and a couple 50s. So the heat is coming for us, hopefully. But this morning, we're going to continue in Mr. Jerzak's book, the section that we're reviewing, and the 7 ways in which we can read the Bible. Hopefully, we're learning some different ways that we can read the Bible. And today, we're going to continue with that, and we're going to be talking about people of the Bible, characters of the Bible. And the title is Under Reconstruction: Crazy Characters, Unreliable Narrators, and the Divine Author. And this morning, we'll go through crazy characters and unreliable narrators, and then we'll finish the next one next week. So the first thing that strikes me here is the word reconstruction. And, we know the word deconstruction. We've talked about it, right? But I like the word reconstruction. I thought that was a different way to look at it. Lately I've had, I get a magazine that had an article about deconstruction. And it was a pretty good article. And the article was trying to point away from that some people are leaving. It wasn't saying they weren't leaving, that people have left their faith, but it was going into another way that you could look at deconstruction, which is exactly what this title is, Reconstruction. It was a pretty good article. Also, I've seen lately a couple blogs on it, and the same type of thing, reconstructing. And I think I said maybe last week a little bit that there are people that seem to be finishing up what they call deconstruction and kind of guiding back towards rebuilding or a new process of their faith and where they're going with it. But I think when we use the term reconstruction, it shows that it's a process. It's not just one thing and we're done. It's one thing and maybe we take that and we change it a little bit, or we add to it and we learn some new things, and then we continue on. And we do that over and over again. We do that through our Christian lives. Even people who don't realize it, they're doing it. It's just happening. But one part of what people might call deconstruction, you got to wonder how many people, I'm figuring a lot, especially if young folks, are angry. They're angry. They get angry because they're deconstructing, and then the things that they learn and the things that people tell them and what they start to realize, that's the emotion they get. And that's kind of where they stop. Because anger can be a blocker, right? If you're on a path and you're going somewhere, maybe in a relationship, and the person does something and you get angry with them, it kind of stops any movement forward until your anger is gone. And if you don't let your anger go, then you never move on with that situation. You just stay there. And I think that might fit, not all people, but it might fit many people in the deconstruction. They wouldn't be in reconstruction because they just stop. It blocks them and they can't get anywhere. They could be angry at the church, angry at the Bible, angry at their parents or anybody who's taught them things about the Bible, about God, maybe even anger at God or anger at Jesus. And I think anger is an emotion that can be used almost as a self-defense. So you suddenly come upon a period of unsurety, and so it makes you angry. And that's kind of something that you put up. Not only does it block you from going, but it stops you from breaking down, really. It keeps you up where you want to be, where you think I'm holding my head up above it all, and forget it. And so that's where you end. But anger can also be a step towards something more meaningful. So if you take your anger, you don't bottle it up, but you use it in a way where you say, okay, let me see what's going on here. And you kind of take a step back, and then you keep going. And I wonder if maybe that could be also Reconstruction. And the reason I bring up anger is not because Mr. Jerzak brought it up. It's because of one of the characters that he mentions. And that character was angry. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this guy for a few minutes after we have a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for the Bible. We thank you for the scriptures. Thank you that we can look back at all these things that are written in there, and the people that are in there that told the story, or people that are in the stories that are being told, and we can look at it all and see how it fits together in the final plan you had in your Son. And very thankful that we get to see the picture of who you are, of who you wanted people to see you were, but also that we still have these things that we can look at to learn about ourselves, learn about those around us, even the world around us, because you have all that in there for us to learn. And as it points to you, we can see where we should be and how we should carry ourselves in you, because that is, I believe, the goal that you have for us in this life, is to follow after you, as Paul says, to imitate you and imitate your Son. Lord, I pray you would help us in that endeavor in our lives so that we can manifest you to those around us. Amen. So, the character he mentions it's Jeremiah. Jeremiah is one of the characters he's going to mention, and I don't know if you would call Jeremiah a crazy character or an unreliable character, but I think Jeremiah would probably be viewed as people around him as crazy. That's certainly how they wanted to portray him. Crazy. Listen to what this guy's saying. None of it's true. It's all false. And of course, then they had their own people to come up and speak against him. But they're always trying to figure out a way to get rid of Jeremiah. But Jeremiah was angry, and he was angry with God, at least in this one scripture we're going to read from, which is going to be Jeremiah 20, if you want to turn over there. Some people would say it's sinful to be angry with God because he's God, right? We don't question God. We don't get angry with him. We don't doubt. We don't do any of those things because he's God. But Jeremiah certainly didn't think it was sinful to be angry. And if he did think it was sinful, he certainly, at least in this moment, wasn't concerned about it. Jeremiah here is going to show some anger after he makes a declaration or a prophecy, and a priest named Pashur hears him, one of the people that hear him. In fact, this particular prophecy was aimed at them, and he takes Jeremiah and he puts him in the stocks because that's what they did with Jeremiah. They took him, they jailed him, they put him in stocks, they threw him places, they beat him, they did whatever they could to get him to shut up. But of course, you know, he wouldn't shut up. You have a whole book of him not keeping his mouth quiet. But after this thing that he goes through with Pashur, Jeremiah complains to God. Now, nowhere in this passage does it say that he's angry. The word anger is not going to come up. But when I read through this passage, I thought, yep, sounds to me like someone's a little upset. It's more than a complaint, right? In verse 7, we'll read verse 7 and 8. This is the opening of his complaint. It says, "O Lord, you have deceived me, and I was deceived. You have overcome me and prevailed. I have become a laughingstock all day long. Everyone mocks me. For each time I speak, I cry aloud. I proclaim violence and destruction, because for me the word of the Lord has resulted in reproach and derision all day long." So he's opening up to God and saying, I have been deceived. And it is you, God, who has deceived me. And he's not happy about it. He is, according to Brad, under some serious deconstruction. Of course, we know that he goes through the whole process. But at this moment, he's realizing something, or he thinks he's realizing something, and that is that God has deceived him or lied to him. And we ask, well, what is it that he lied about? Jeremiah was a young man, and God said, you are going to be a prophet. You're going to speak the things that I give you, and you're going to go to my people, and you're going to tell them what they're doing. You know, Jeremiah said that he proclaims violence and destruction. Well, there was some proclamations of what was going to happen to Israel. However, there were also things that said, if you turn from your ways, none of this will happen. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. But that's how Jeremiah sees it, because when you're angry, that's what comes out, right? You see all the bad. You look past everything else. Jeremiah did not want to be a prophet. And he told God, I'm too young. I can't speak. That sounds like Moses, right? Isn't that what Moses said? Moses wasn't young, but Moses said, I am not eloquent. You know, think about what Moses' job was. You think about a sheep herder that lives in the wilderness, doesn't have a lot of speech background or doesn't talk to people a lot. And Jeremiah is claiming something similar. But God says to him, basically, that's all nonsense. I'm going to speak for you. All you have to do is go out. But in Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 19, when Jeremiah is worried about being a prophet, you know, wonder why would any prophet in Jeremiah's day, if they heard the call to be a prophet, what would they be worried about? Getting killed. It would be worried about death, beatings, tortures, and all the rest, because that's what happened. And so, you know, he didn't want to. You think of Jonah. Jonah didn't, I don't know if Jonah was worried about being killed. He was just worried that the people that he was going to were actually going to follow, and God was going to be gracious, and he didn't want to do it. But I think most of them probably had in the back of their mind, this is not going to go well. In verse 19, God tells Jeremiah, they will fight against you, but they will not overcome you. For I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. And so I think here in chapter 20, I don't know how many times between chapter 1 and chapter 20, Jeremiah was jailed or beaten or just laughed at or mocked. But he came to a point here where he's remembering, why am I in the stocks? I'm not supposed to be in the stocks. You said that you would deliver me. And this isn't going the way that you said it was going to go. So Jeremiah thinks he was deceived. He thinks he hasn't been delivered. It's certainly, if you read Jeremiah, you can see that in a physical sense, he doesn't seem to have been delivered. But I think that God probably had something bigger in mind a bigger picture there than the immediate things like being put in the stocks. But Jeremiah, as I said, is a little angry, and possibly, as Brad says, going through some deconstruction. If we go back to chapter 20, there's somebody else that Jeremiah sounds like in this. After I've read this before and thought the same thing, but you read this passage and you think Jeremiah might be well read or well versed in his upbringing. The oldest book of the Bible is not Genesis, in case you didn't know. Oldest book in the Bible is Job. Job was written before any of them were written, which is kind of neat. And Jeremiah here is going to parrot the book of Job, or something similar to it. In verse 14 of chapter 20, he says, "Cursed be the day when I was born. Let the day not be blessed when my mother bore me. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father, saying, a baby boy has been born to you," and made him very happy. He goes on to say that guy should be just like any city that God has ever judged, and that city is no longer on the face of the earth. Because what I'm going through right now, to me, makes me wish that I had never been born. That sounds familiar to me, not just because of Job, but I'm pretty sure that sometime in my life, I have said something similar, right? Haven't we all? Some terrible things come, and we say things like that. But Jeremiah is saying, I wish, or that day was cursed, and I was never born, because why? Because I've been deceived by God, and I'm being made to be a prophet, and I didn't want to be. So that's Jeremiah. You can read through Jeremiah. I think I'm going to read Jeremiah in a little new light about the Reconstruction, deconstruction, because I find that interesting. Always a different way to read things. But we're just talking about Job, and Job is another book that we could look at for Reconstruction. The book of Job, I believe, is a book, as what Brad calls the Bible, a book of Reconstruction. So the Bible's showing certain views of God, and God is slowly bringing it about until we see who he is. And Job is, I think, a microcosm of all that put into one book. It's a story within a wider story that has a point. Jeremiah, Jesus, and Paul each did major Reconstruction work. Brad uses the word radical. He says all three were radical in their proclamations and what they were saying. And they were. It was radical enough to cause people to be so angry with them that all they wanted to do was kill them. Because it was stuff they didn't want to hear, whether they knew it to be true or somewhere in their heart and they didn't want to hear it, or they just didn't believe it. I would say that they were probably beyond anger. They were enraged at all of it. I mentioned Jonah a moment ago. And Jonah, he ran. He went the other way because he didn't want to go to Nineveh, because he was afraid the people of Nineveh would repent. By the end of Jonah, we see a man, even though he seemed sorrowful in his mind, he was angry. He was enraged that God would forgive these people. We can read through scriptures about Assyria, which Nineveh was the capital of. You can read about history and the exploits of the Assyrian army, and the Assyrians, they weren't a very nice people when they went out conquering. But Jonah knew this, and so he was unhappy about it. So Death would be the ideal end for all of these men who gave such radical ideas about what people thought that God was, because ultimately that's what it was. These people have a certain view of who God is, and as soon as someone came behind and said, no, that's not who he is, you are seeing things incorrectly, it threatened the status quo, and it was seen as radical. The Bible, he says, is an epic journey told through some incredible characters, and some words that aren't in here, but he says, to me, they're people also with checkered pasts, but they're in there for a reason. People like Jonah, people like Jeremiah, and people like Job are in the story for a reason. Ultimately, the reason is that it pointed to Jesus and the saving work he was going to do. Jonah, in and of itself, is a book. It's a gospel. Think about it. It's a place that's unsaved, unbelieving, lives like the world fully, and someone is sent there to preach a message from God to them, to a people that don't even worship God, unlike Jesus, who went to Israel. He goes there and they listen and they're saved. And so that is the book of Jonah. So each time we read these things and we go through the Bible, we remember that it's all a journey towards who Jesus was. In Mr. Father Rohr's latest email, there was something, I can't remember who, he was saying, quoting someone from their book. And in the book, the person mentioned a woman, and I can't remember her name. But in it, he said that Jesus, something along the lines of Jesus came and he was preaching inclusion. And the only people that were excluded were the excluders. And I thought that was pretty good. And we do the same thing today, and that's exactly what Jonah was about. In fact, now I look at Jonah and I think, well, there is a Pharisee, if there was ever a Pharisee, is Jonah. There were no Pharisees when Jonah was around, but maybe they took after Jonah and said, this is how we're going to be. It certainly seems that way. They were excluders. So in this chapter, there are a few points, and we're going to go over the first three. I believe first three. Yep. And then after that, next week, we'll finish the last. So the first one that Brad brings out is that the whole Bible is an epic story of God's love. And, each of these points he has he has them pretty short. But when I think of the whole Bible being an epic story of God's love, and I try to think of where is it telling me that the whole Bible is an epic story of God's love. And I think of the verses that started all this off, which is Luke chapter 24, verses 25 to 27. Because I think here, as Jesus is talking to them on the road to Emmaus, that we could take from this that Jesus is saying everything pointed right here. This was the purpose of all of it. Because he says in verse 25, and he said to them, O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? Then beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And it all pointed if it's an epic story of God's love and you read things in the Old Testament that aren't seemingly epic stories of God's love, how does that work? Well, Jesus brought it all out to them. All of it points to the cross. In John, it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son." I'm just going to read one small paragraph that is under this heading. The Bible is an epic story of God's love. Brad says, "The arc of the story is about how love creates a beloved cosmos for love's sake. Or as my friend, Father Kenneth Tanner says, God loves the world that God made, including humanity. And then God became what God made." I remember when I first read that, I underlined it, and I drew a little cross, because that's exactly what God did. He made something, and he loved it so much that he came in the form of what he made, so that he could relate, have that relationship, direct, one-on-one. Come on, get to know me, see who I am, because it's not who you think I am. I think that if anybody is reading through the Bible and doesn't get that it's one big story pointing to one big happening, that much of it is going to be lost to them. They're going to miss what is really going on. When I read the word epic story, to me, as a young man, when I read Lord of the Rings, that's an epic story. It's long, right? You get the book, it's huge. Of course, the book doesn't come on really thin paper like the Bible. So it's probably about the same length, but it comes in a thicker form, depending on what you get. The one I got, I borrowed from Miss Joy, and it was thick. It was a hardcover. It had maps and all kinds of stuff in it. It was an epic story. What is the point of the story of the Lord of the Rings? There's only one point. Get the ring and throw it in the fire so that you can release everybody from bondage to evil. That's the story. But when you read it, there's dozens and dozens of different sidelines and stories that happen, and they all track one young person's journey from getting something that they didn't even know what they had, and then saying, I don't even know if I really want this responsibility, to finally having it come to end. When they made the movies, they took a lot of these things out because they couldn't fit it all in. You can get the extended versions, which have them all in there. But come to find out, you could go through that whole book and take all these little stories out and still show the one purpose of the story. And that, to me, is kind of like what the Bible is. You can remove a lot of these crazy characters and things from the story and go straight to what it was about. But that would be missing the story. All of the other things that come along with it are being told for a reason. So we want to read them, and we want to see what they are. And so his second heading is many characters, some villains. I changed this a little bit, wicked and messy. These were included with those that are the good. So there are people in the Bible that we read, even in the Old Testament, and we think, I want to be like that person. They're good. There's others we read about, and we read, I would never want to be like that person. How could God have possibly used that person? That's exactly what Jonah was saying. How could you possibly forgive these people? Matthew's genealogy inserts 4 women into Jesus' ancestry. All of them were from what eventually we read in the Bible as the nations. At least two of them were of questionable character. Actually, the only one who wasn't is probably Ruth, right? But Ruth wasn't an Israelite, yet she's in Jesus' ancestry. And so were the other three. And then, of course, we have David, who used criminal acts to gain a wife, who is mentioned also. His wife, Bathsheba, is in Matthew's genealogy. In some translations, I don't know what the original manuscripts were, but I eventually figured out that some translations say her name and some don't. Some just say the wife of, because I'm guessing they don't want to say who she is or have her name in there. But we learned some time ago that it's possible that she was also of questionable character. Then there are what we many times will call the heroes of Judges, which include people like Samson, Gideon, questions God, right? But God still uses him. I think that's a sure lesson for us. Can't be afraid to question. Can't be afraid. There are also villains like Jezebel, Brad mentions, and Judas. I think he mentions a couple others, but these are possibly, he says, to remind us of how easily, or I said, it reminds us, it could remind us of how easily life turns on us. And suddenly we find ourselves doing the same things or in the same position, even those around us. He says even possibly our nations. We see these things and we remember and we can relate because we read to them, we read about them in the scriptures. And of course there's Paul. Paul was a villainous character, and yet he was saved and used by God. These are reminders to us that God can use anybody. God can take anything and bring good out of it. That's what God does. And even those, if you read about people like Jezebel, he came to a very horrible demise. Jezebel never came around. You might seem that there was never good that can come from Jezebel, but the good that comes from Jezebel is the fact that her story's in there and we can read, and even today people will say they're a Jezebel because of who she is. So we can learn about who we are and who we should be and should not be, and we can learn about who God is and who God isn't through these stories. The third, he says, are with many perspectives. It's with multiple composers and unreliable narrators. This is the one that I found the most interesting because I learned something about what an unreliable narrator is. When I read unreliable narrator, I thought Brad was trying to say that the Bible narrative is unreliable, or parts of it were unreliable. And so I tried to think up things in my mind of things I've read, like why does it say one place that God incited David to take a census, and then in the other one it says Satan invited him to take a census. And I think, well, that's unreliable. And of course, we have all kinds of reasons why that happened. But that is in no way what an unreliable narrator is. So he gives some extra biblical examples, including a book he co-wrote, which I've never read. But I'm not going to talk about his examples. I'm going to use Job as an example. It is quite possible in the book of Job that there are more than one narrator, but each of them is an unreliable narrator. Now, by the end of Job, this is told, as I think either last week or the week before, we saw that by the end of Job, God was telling them what? You're wrong. All of you are wrong, except for Job, but only in what Job just said, which was, I apologize. I spoke of you wrongly. Before that, all of them, the three friends, the young man, and Job, and Job's wife, all of them spoke of God wrongly. So, through the book of Job, then, the narration is unreliable. It is told to us by the divine narration. So, what happens when we're unaware that such a literary tool, because that's what unreliable narrative is, we'll see that in a second, it's a literary tool that is used frequently in books, in novels, in movies, even modern movies, that are told through a narrator. I had to look it up online, and there was a movie which I've never seen, but it described how the movie starts off and a person's narrating. And the movie continues, and all these different things happen. And then halfway through the movie, the narrator switches. And it's a different person narrating. And then the movie keeps going with the same character, but the narration is from a completely different viewpoint. And then at the end, hopefully the person watching the movie got what the movie was about and what was going on. It wasn't said plainly. It was almost like Job. There was a couple lines snuck in there that hopefully everybody caught, and then they would understand that the narrators were telling it from their own viewpoint, but this is what really happened. That's what an unreliable narrator does. They tell something. They said Forrest Gump. I've never seen Forrest Gump. And people always look at me and say, how could you have never seen Forrest Gump? Forrest Gump is a story told through this literary tool, an unreliable narrator. But I learned there's several different types of unreliable narrators. He was a naive, unreliable narrator. He's telling a story of the world and all these things that happened through his mind, which is obviously undeveloped. And so he doesn't really understand what's going on. He only sees the really cool stuff or the really bad stuff, but there's other things that are going on, and we know that. But that's what unreliable narration is. But what happens when you don't know that's what you're reading? When I looked up unreliable narrator in the Bible, and the first page that came up said, there's a question asked on a site, is there unreliable narration in the Bible? And the answer was no, never, because the Bible is literally, factually true, every single part of it. There are no literary tools used in the Bible because it's God's words spoken directly. That's what this answer was. But that was the only one. After that, all of them said yes, and they made little examples of places where you find it. But what happens when we don't know that's what we're reading? Well, we sing songs. And in the songs, there's one particularly, and I can't remember the name of the group, but it's a song I really enjoyed for a time. And it's Blessed Be the Name of the Lord. It's not the one that we've sung, or 10,000 Reasons, but the chorus goes, Blessed be the name of the Lord, and they say it over and over and over again. And then as the song starts to come to an end, they sneak in another little phrase that people sing behind that. It says, He gives and takes away. He gives and takes away. He gives and takes away. And when you sing the song, you think, oh, such a great song. But then when you stop and you think about the words, you're like, well, wait a minute. He gives and takes away. That's what Job said. When his family was taken away, when his sheep and cattle and his servants and everything he had was gone. So it kind of puts a different spin on the song, right? The person's obviously trying to say, blessed be the Lord, he's in control of everything. He gives and takes away. But we take that from a book, and we didn't know it was an unreliable narration. And at the end of the book, God sneaks in there in a line, you're all wrong, except for Job. And then people think, oh, well, Job, everything Job said was right. But that is not the case. because it is a literary work, and it is refuting something. It's refuting the viewpoints of men about God. I think that when I think about Job, being the oldest book of the Bible, when I learned it was the oldest book of the Bible, I just thought, wow. So here it is, before Israel or before Moses or before anybody started writing about their relationship with God, a book was written, or a story was written about a man who something happened to, and then following that were inserts from different viewpoints of men about who God was. And then by the end, God is saying, no, it's not who I am. And so knowing that that book is the oldest book of the Bible, and that that story has probably been told numerous times to even the people in the Bible, like Moses, maybe. It was probably a well-known story. That's what I've read. They still didn't understand who God was. They were still missing the point. Life in the book of Job includes suffering. People like to say, life happens, right? Something bad happens and you just think, it's life. We move on, hopefully. And so that was an unreliable narrator. It's a points of view from different people about something that's happening, but underneath it all, there's a story that's trying to be told, a grand epic, as Brad calls the Bible. I think it's interesting. So for me, not only do I have accusers and victims and law, now I also have to have, I need a little book with me when I'm reading the Bible now, with a check mark. Now I want to read unreliable narrators. When is the narration being told in the scriptures in a way to say, read the narration, it's from a person's point of view, but what's underneath the story? I have the benefit now of knowing what's underneath the story, right? So I think it's really cool. So, no, Job is not a liar. The book is not a liar. As I said last week, it's true because it was someone's viewpoint of something. The fact that it turns out not to be correct doesn't mean anything. In fact, it means, I shouldn't say anything, it means everything. Because all the ways that we hear people today talk about God and all the preconceived notions that Christianity has about God and that teaches about God, much of it comes from the same type of thinking that comes out of the book of Job. And we learned that it wasn't true, that it wasn't correct. It wasn't true to who God is. So another way to read the Bible, unreliable narratives. Crazy characters. We read people and understand what they are. Many things in the Bible, including the book of Job, can be thought of a riddle. That's kind of what an unreliable narrator is. Someone who's weaving a riddle for us to figure out. So Job and his friends had a limited field of vision regarding God. So they told the story through their own viewpoints. And that's the same viewpoint or the same idea that many in the Bible, from Moses, David, Solomon, the heroes of Judges, all of them. But there is something underneath it, and that's what we want to get to. And that is what Jesus, I believe, tried to bring out to the people after he reappeared to them after his resurrection. This is who I am. This is who your Father is. And it's all in here. It's all in there. You just never connected it and you missed it. Even when he finally came to you in the flesh and lived it out for you, you still missed it because you were stuck on your preconceived notions. And so that's where we're going to end it for today. And next week we will pick it up with from that section in the divine narrator.